Introduction. In the summer of 1849, New York City erupted in violence. The Astor Place riot, as it came to be known, left at least 25 people dead and more than 120 injured. The immediate cause was a theatrical rivalry between American actor Edwin Forrest and British actor William Charles Macready. But beneath this cultural clash lay deeper tensions, class resentment, anti-British sentiment, and the growing pains of a young democracy. The riot took place outside the Astor Opera House, a building that stood as a symbol of the wealth and influence of one of America's most powerful families. The story of the Astors is, in many ways, the story of America itself. From humble beginnings as a German immigrant selling musical instruments, John Jacob Astor built an empire through the fur trade and Manhattan real estate that would make him America's first multi-millionaire. His descendants would go on to shape New York society, influence American politics, and leave an indelible mark on the cultural landscape. Through their rise and eventual decline, we witness the transformation of American society from a fledgling republic to a global superpower. This historical journey offers insights into the nature of wealth, the responsibilities of privilege, and the complex legacy of one family's outsized impact on American life. Chapter 1. Immigrant Origins, John Jacob Astor's Arrival 1784 to 1800. In 1784, a 20-year-old German immigrant named John Jacob Astor arrived in America with little more than ambition and a few flutes to sell. The timing of his arrival was fortuitous. The Revolutionary War had just ended, and the young nation was eager to establish its economic independence. New York City, though still recovering from British occupation, was poised to become a commercial hub. Astor, who had worked in his brother's musical instrument shop in London, quickly recognized that America offered opportunities unavailable in class-bound Europe. Astor's entry into the fur trade came through a chance encounter with a fur trader who shared insights about the lucrative business. With remarkable adaptability, Astor learned the trade and began purchasing pelts from Native American trappers, particularly prizing beaver pelts, which were in high demand for fashionable hats in Europe. He displayed an uncanny ability to anticipate market trends and navigate complex international trade networks. Despite trade restrictions, Astor found creative ways to ship furs to China, where they commanded premium prices, and return with tea, silk, and porcelain for the American market. What distinguished Astor from his contemporaries was not just his business acumen, but his strategic vision. While others focused on immediate profits, Astor reinvested his earnings, gradually building a commercial empire. He learned multiple languages to facilitate his international dealings and cultivated relationships with political leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. These connections would later prove invaluable as he expanded his operations westward. Astor understood that in the new republic, economic and political power were intertwined. The foundation of Astor's fortune revealed both the opportunities and moral compromises of early American capitalism. His fur trading practices often exploited Native American trappers through unfair pricing and the strategic use of alcohol in negotiations. As one contemporary observed, Astor could calculate the value of a pelt down to the penny, but seemed unable to calculate the human cost of his enterprise. This pattern of extracting maximum value while minimizing compensation would become a hallmark of his business approach. By 1800, Astor had established himself as one of New York's wealthiest merchants, but his ambitions extended far beyond the fur trade. He began systematically investing in Manhattan real estate, purchasing large tracts of undeveloped land well north of the city's populated areas. Critics mocked these investments in seemingly worthless property, but Astor understood what many failed to grasp, that the island's limited geography would eventually make land the most valuable commodity in New York. This insight would transform his substantial fortune into an astronomical one, establishing a dynasty that would influence American society for generations to come. Chapter 2. Building an Empire. Fur Trade and Manhattan Real Estate, 1800–1848. The early 19th century saw John Jacob Astor transform from a successful merchant into America's first multimillionaire through two primary ventures: the expansion of his fur trading empire and strategic investments in Manhattan real estate. In 1808, Astor established the American Fur Company, which would eventually control much of the fur trade in the United States. His most ambitious project came in 1810 when, with the encouragement of President Thomas Jefferson, he launched an expedition to establish Astoria, a trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River in present-day Oregon. This venture represented America's first attempt to establish a permanent settlement on the Pacific coast. The Astoria expedition revealed both Astor's visionary thinking and ruthless business methods. He dispatched two parties, one by sea aboard the ill-fated Tonquin and another overland, in a dangerous journey that cost many lives. Though the outpost was eventually sold to British interests during the War of 1812, the venture demonstrated Astor's willingness to take calculated risks for potential long-term gains. His fur trading operations employed brutal tactics, including price fixing, predatory lending to trappers, and the deliberate destruction of competitors. By the 1820s, the American Fur Company had established a virtual monopoly, with annual profits exceeding $500,000, equivalent to millions in today's currency. As Astor accumulated wealth from the fur trade, he began systematically investing in Manhattan real estate. He purchased large tracts of land in what would later become Midtown, Hell's Kitchen, and the Upper East Side, areas that were then farmland or undeveloped wilderness. Rather than developing the properties himself, Astor typically leased the land to others who would construct buildings at their own expense. When the leases expired, Astor or his heirs would take possession of both the land and improvements. This strategy minimized risk while maximizing long-term returns. Astor's real estate empire was built not just on foresight, but also on exploitation. As a landlord, he became notorious for charging exorbitant rents while providing minimal maintenance. He created a system of sub-landlords who further squeezed tenants, particularly in poorer neighborhoods. During the financial panic of 1837, when many New Yorkers faced economic ruin, Astor foreclosed on numerous properties, significantly expanding his holdings. His approach to business was summarized in his famous quote, "The best time to buy is when blood is running in the streets." By the time of his death in 1848, John Jacob Astor had amassed a fortune estimated at $20 million, approximately $600 million in today's currency, making him by far the wealthiest person in America. His will carefully distributed this wealth primarily among his male descendants, ensuring the continuation of the Astor dynasty. The fortune he built would transform his family from merchants into aristocrats, with his children and grandchildren becoming key figures in New York's emerging social elite. More significantly, the Astor legacy would reshape Manhattan itself, as the family's vast real estate holdings influenced the very development pattern of America's most important city. Chapter 3. Society's Gatekeepers. The Mrs. Astor and Gilded Age, 1870–1908. The period following the Civil War witnessed unprecedented economic growth in America, creating enormous wealth for industrialists and financiers. Into this environment stepped Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, who married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of John Jacob. Though born into the old Dutch aristocracy of New York, it was Caroline who would transform the Astor name from merely wealthy to socially supreme. From the 1870s through the 1890s, Caroline, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, established herself as the undisputed arbiter of New York high society during what Mark Twain dubbed the Gilded Age. Caroline Astor's rise to social prominence came at a time when new money threatened to overwhelm old social hierarchies. Railroad magnates, steel barons, and Wall Street financiers had accumulated fortunes that dwarfed those of established families. In response, Caroline developed an elaborate system of social rituals designed to separate proper society from the merely rich. Working with Social Secretary Ward McAllister, she created the famous 400, supposedly the number of people who could fit comfortably in her ballroom, but in reality, a carefully curated list of families deemed worthy of social recognition. To be excluded from Mrs. Astor's annual ball was to be condemned to social oblivion. The Astor mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue became the epicenter of elite social life. Caroline's annual balls were legendary affairs with elaborate decorations, orchestras, and French cuisine. The evening would begin with a receiving line where guests would bow or curtsy to Mrs. Astor before proceeding to the ballroom. These events were not merely entertainment, but performances of class identity, with intricate rules governing everything from the proper length of gloves to acceptable conversation topics. As one contemporary observer noted, Mrs. Astor did not create society, but she organized and codified it with almost Napoleonic precision. behind the glittering facade of Astor social dominance lay a complex web of real estate holdings that generated enormous wealth. While Caroline presided over ballrooms, her husband William managed the family's vast property empire, which included much of what is now Midtown Manhattan. The Astors had become absentee landlords on a massive scale, collecting rents from properties ranging from luxury hotels to squalid tenements. This disconnect between the source of Astor wealth and its social expression exemplified the contradictions of the Gilded Age: extreme opulence existing alongside extreme poverty, often separated by just a few city blocks. Caroline's social reign faced its greatest challenge in 1883 when Alva Vanderbilt, wife of railroad heir William K. Vanderbilt, threw an elaborate costume ball that outshone anything the Astors had ever produced. After initially snubbing the Vanderbilts as nouveau riche, Caroline was forced to acknowledge their social claims when her daughter Carrie wished to attend Alva's ball. This marked a turning point in New York society, as money increasingly trumped lineage in determining social standing. By the time of Caroline's death in 1908, the rigid social structure she had maintained was already crumbling, giving way to a more fluid society where celebrity and wealth would increasingly determine status. Nevertheless, her legacy as the definitive social gatekeeper of the Gilded Age would endure in American cultural memory. Chapter 4: Transatlantic Ambitions, Family Division and European Aristocracy, 1890 to 1920. The final decade of the 19th century marked a significant turning point for the Astor family as their unified American identity began to fracture along transatlantic lines. This division was precipitated by William Waldorf Astor, great-grandson of John Jacob, who in 1891 made the dramatic decision to relocate to England. Frustrated by his cousin's wife Caroline's social dominance and his own failed political ambitions, he had served as a New York State Assemblyman and unsuccessfully ran for Congress. William sought the aristocratic recognition that eluded him in America. His departure created two distinct branches of the family: the American Astors and the English Astors, each pursuing different visions of what the Astor legacy should represent. William Waldorf's move to England was accompanied by a calculated campaign to establish himself in British high society. He purchased Cliveden, a magnificent country estate, and later acquired Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. He donated lavishly to British causes and used his newspaper holdings to curry favor with the establishment. His efforts culminated in 1916 when he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Astor of Hever Castle, becoming the first American-born British peer. His son Waldorf would marry Nancy Langhorne, who would later make history as the first woman to take a seat in the British Parliament. The English Astors thus traded American Republican values for British aristocratic traditions. Meanwhile, in America, the Astor family continued to wield enormous influence through their real estate holdings and social position. John Jacob Astor IV, Caroline's son, embodied the American branch's approach to wealth and status. Unlike his British cousin, he embraced modern technology and business ventures, investing in innovations like the Astoria Hotel, which later merged with his cousin's Waldorf Hotel to become the famous Waldorf Astoria. He also wrote science fiction and volunteered for military service during the Spanish-American War. His 1911 marriage to the much younger Madeline Force caused a social scandal that even his mother could not quell. The symbolic culmination of the family's division came in the construction of the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel. When William Waldorf demolished his family home next to Caroline Astor's mansion to build the Waldorf Hotel in 1893, it was widely interpreted as an act of spite against his aunt. Caroline initially refused to acknowledge the hotel's existence, but eventually capitulated and moved uptown. Her son later built the adjoining Astoria Hotel, and the combined Waldorf Astoria became a new kind of social space, one where old money and new could mingle in public, eroding the private social barriers Caroline had worked so hard to maintain. The transatlantic division of the Astor family reflected broader changes in American society during this period. As industrial wealth created new fortunes that dwarfed even the Astors' holdings, the family's relative economic power declined. Some Astors, like William Waldorf, responded by seeking the security of established European aristocracy, while others, like John Jacob IV, attempted to adapt to changing American values. This period of transition would be dramatically punctuated in 1912 when John Jacob IV perished in the sinking of the Titanic, becoming perhaps the most famous victim of the disaster. His death marked not just a personal tragedy, but symbolized the vulnerable position of America's old money families as they faced the uncertainties of the 20th century. Chapter 5: Titanic Tragedy, Symbolism, and Changing Fortunes, 1912-1930. The sinking of the RMS Titanic on April 15, 1912, with John Jacob Astor IV among its victims, marked more than the loss of the family's most prominent member. It symbolized the beginning of the Astor dynasty's gradual decline. As the wealthiest passenger aboard the doomed ship, Colonel Astor's death made headlines worldwide, overshadowing the loss of many less privileged lives. The tragedy left his 18-year-old pregnant widow Madeline to navigate both personal grief and the complexities of the Astor fortune. Their son, John Jacob Astor VI, was born 4 months after the disaster and dubbed the Titanic Baby by the press, but would inherit only a fraction of his father's wealth, with the bulk going to Vincent Astor, the colonel's son from his first marriage. Vincent Astor, at age 20, suddenly found himself responsible for managing one of America's greatest fortunes. Unlike previous generations of Astor men, Vincent displayed a social conscience that sometimes seemed at odds with the source of his wealth. Upon discovering the deplorable conditions in Astor-owned tenements, he began selling off much of the family's slum properties. He established the Vincent Astor Foundation to support social welfare projects and built playgrounds in underprivileged neighborhoods. Yet Vincent's personal life was marked by unhappiness. His first marriage to Helen Dinsmore Huntington proved disastrous, and he developed a reputation for being socially awkward despite his enormous wealth. The 1920s brought significant challenges to the Astor real estate empire. The family had always preferred to lease rather than sell their Manhattan properties, but this strategy became less viable as development patterns changed. The center of New York's commercial activity shifted northward, leaving some Astor holdings in less desirable locations. Meanwhile, newer fortunes, particularly those made in finance and industry, eclipsed the Astor wealth. The family that had once dominated New York society now found itself just one among many wealthy families, and no longer the wealthiest or most influential. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent depression further eroded the Astor position. While their real estate holdings provided some insulation from the worst effects of the economic collapse, the value of their properties declined significantly. Vincent Astor lost millions in the crash, though he remained enormously wealthy by any standard. More significantly, the Depression transformed American attitudes toward wealth and privilege. The ostentatious displays of the Gilded Age became politically and socially untenable as unemployment soared and breadlines formed across the nation. By the mid-1930s, the Astor family had fragmented into various branches with diminishing connections to one another. The English Astors, led by Waldorf and Nancy Astor, maintained their position in British society but had little involvement with their American relatives. In New York, the family name still commanded respect, but the cohesive Astor identity had largely dissolved. When Vincent Astor's yacht Norma Hull carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt on a fishing trip in 1934, it represented a final moment of political relevance for a family whose influence was rapidly waning. The era of Astor dominance, spanning from John Jacob's arrival in 1784 to the Great Depression, had effectively come to an end, though the family name would continue to evoke memories of America's Gilded Age. Chapter 6: The Last Astors, Philanthropy and Legacy, 1930 to 2007. In 1953, Vincent Astor, the last direct male descendant of John Jacob Astor in the main American branch, married Brooke Marshall, a 51-year-old widow who would ultimately become known as the last Mrs. Astor. Their marriage came after Vincent's 2 previous failed unions and was arranged with the help of his second wife, Minnie Cushing. Though Vincent was notoriously difficult, moody, paranoid, and controlling, Brooke managed the relationship skillfully. When he died in 1959 after just 5.5 years of marriage, he left her in control of his vast fortune, including a $60 million trust fund and the Vincent Astor Foundation. This transfer of wealth to a woman who was not an Astor by blood represented a significant break with family tradition. Brooke Astor reinvented herself and the Astor legacy through her philanthropic work. Unlike previous generations who had built wealth through real estate speculation and development, Brooke focused on giving money away in a highly visible manner. She transformed the Vincent Astor Foundation into a major force in New York civic life, supporting the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and numerous smaller neighborhood projects. Her approach to philanthropy was hands-on. She would personally visit Harlem housing projects and homeless shelters to see how her donations were being used. As she famously remarked, "Money is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around." Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Brooke Astor became a beloved figure in New York society, known for her elegance, wit, and generosity. Always impeccably dressed in Chanel suits with her signature pearls and wide-brimmed hats, she maintained an active social schedule well into her 90s. Unlike Caroline Astor, who had used social position to exclude others, Brooke used her status to bring people together across social boundaries. Her dinner parties might include politicians, artists, academics, and business leaders in combinations designed to spark interesting conversation rather than reinforce social hierarchies. The final chapter of the Astor story took a tragic turn when, in her last years, Brooke became the center of a highly publicized elder abuse case. In 2006, her grandson Philip Marshall filed a petition alleging that his father, Anthony Marshall, was neglecting Brooke's care while misappropriating her fortune. The ensuing legal battle exposed family divisions and resulted in Anthony Marshall's conviction for defrauding his mother. The case brought national attention to the issue of elder abuse and tarnished the Astor name that Brooke had worked so hard to rehabilitate. When Brooke Astor died in 2007 at the age of 105, her passing marked the end of an era. The fortune that John Jacob Astor had begun accumulating more than 2 centuries earlier was largely dispersed through taxation and philanthropy. The family name lived on primarily in the landmarks scattered throughout New York City: Astor Place, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the Astor Court at the Metropolitan Museum, and in cultural memory as symbols of American wealth and privilege. The Astor story had come full circle, from an immigrant's ambitious gamble to the dissolution of a great fortune, encompassing along the way much of the American experience of wealth, power, and social transformation. Summary: the Astor saga reveals a central paradox of American wealth: the tension between private accumulation and public responsibility. Beginning with John Jacob's ruthless business practices in the fur trade and Manhattan real estate, continuing through Caroline's exclusionary social reign, and culminating in Brooke's philanthropic redistribution, the family embodied changing American attitudes toward extreme wealth. Each generation faced the question of what obligations, if any, the wealthy have to the society that enabled their fortune. The Astors variously answered this question by creating rigid social hierarchies, seeking European titles, building cultural institutions, and eventually giving much of their fortune away. Their story traces America's evolving relationship with its wealthy elite, from admiration to resentment to expectations of social responsibility. The Astor legacy offers valuable insights for our contemporary moment, as wealth inequality again reaches Gilded Age proportions. First, it reminds us that great fortunes are rarely built through merit alone, but often through a combination of timing, exploitation, and political influence. Second, it demonstrates how wealth that remains concentrated across generations tends to disconnect from productive enterprise and become primarily focused on its own preservation. Finally, the Astor story suggests that wealth ultimately finds meaning not in accumulation, but in purpose, whether that purpose is social dominance, cultural patronage, or philanthropic redistribution. As new fortunes emerge in our digital Gilded Age, the question remains whether today's wealthy will learn from the Astor's journey or repeat its pattern of excess, insularity, and eventual decline.